100개가 넘는 도시들이 나오기 때문에 반드시 복수가 표현이 돼야 되고 보르헤스의 피치오네스도 픽션들로 표현하고 이런 것들이 굉장히 바람직한 지도이고 앞으로도 좀 더 과감하고 원작에 충실한 그러한 그 한글 번역, 제목 번역들이 많이 나오기를 기대해 봅니다. 경청해 주셔서 감사합니다.
Thank you, Professor Yoon Hae-jun, for such a fascinating and entertaining talk. Would you mind? Do you know how to? Okay, Laura. Thank you. Sorry. Thank you. Born in Carlisle, England, and raised in Nairobi, Kenya, and Newcastle upon Tyne, Mike Figgis is an artist who combines various disciplines. After studying music and playing with a variety of ensembles, Mike joined the experimental performance group People Show and toured extensively for 10 years. Upon forming his own group, Mike began to experiment with film and sound, combining these elements with live theater and opera.
Laura, I got squashed.
What's... Sorry.
She's saying, I don't look like that.
His first film, a one-hour political fantasy for the Channel 4 called The House, brought him into the domain of cinema. Stormy Monday, set in the gritty crime world of Newcastle, combines British and American actors. Its success in the United States led Mike to an extended period of mainstream feature filmmaking in Los Angeles. After the success of Internal Affairs, a noirish thriller which helped revive the career of Richard Gere, Figgis found himself continually at odds with the Hollywood system and resolved to try other directions. Leaving Las Vegas, financed by an independent French company, was made on a very low budget and shot on super 16mm film in 24 days. A huge success, the film received 4 Academy Awards nominations. Elizabeth Shue for Best Actress, Mike Figgis for Best Writer and Best Director. Figgis also composed the score for the film, and Nicolas Cage, who won the Oscar for Best Actor. Encouraged by the success of a more experimental and minimal approach to filmmaking, Mike Figgis continued to push boundaries. The film Time Code in 2000 was the first real-time digital film ever made. Since 2000, Mike Figgis has been at the forefront of the digital revolution. The Fig Rig was designed by Mike specifically for the new generation of smaller digital cameras, and this innovative camera support system has spawned countless variations. Figgis' other creative works are numerous. As a performing musician, he is a member of the People Band, a free music ensemble. He has directed several operas, including The Ground Beneath Her Feet, an adaptation of Salman Rushdie's novel, at the Manchester International Music Festival, and Lucrezia Borgia at the English National Opera. As a curator, Mike has been responsible for a number of multifaceted events, notably the Just Tell the Truth Festival at the Royal Opera House in 2011. Figgis has been working as a professional photographer for many years, and his portraits of Kate Moss have become iconic. A series of his pop-up portrait exhibitions has taken place in London, Łódź, Poland, New York, and Hong Kong. Mike Figgis devotes considerable time to teaching and writing books and articles on cinema techniques. His bestsellers, Digital Filmmaking and the 36 Dramatic Situations for Cinema, both addressing the challenges of the new cinema, have become textbooks for young filmmakers. Mike Figgis is now actively exploring alternative strategies in film production, shifting away from the restrictive practices of the American and European systems, and designing new platforms, both economic and creative, for the contemporary filmmaker. He is a regular visiting professor at the National Film and Television School in England, which he once applied to be a student at but was rejected. The London Film School, the European Graduate School, the Cuban Film School, Nanjing University, and, as of today, Yonsei University, where as Shinhan Professor, he will be teaching his intensive UIC seminar entitled Dramatic Arts in the Digital Age. However, Professor Figgis is not just here to teach. He also plans to make a film in Korea. This summer, new screenplay in hand, he came to Seoul for the first time to photograph actors, meet with studio executives and production teams, and scout out locations. Mike, we are very lucky and happy to have you with us here today. Please join me in giving a warm welcome to Professor Mike Figgis.
Good afternoon. It's a pleasure to be here. A great honor to be invited at such an interesting and I'm sure provocative symposium. Although it is ironic that I don't speak any Korean, so I have no idea what anyone's been saying. So, but I'm a great fan of irony. So. I also feel a little bit like a cheat for being here because my book, which I will talk about, of course, is not a translation from French, which was the original language of Georges Polti when he wrote the book in the 1890s in Paris. And someone asked me a very interesting question at the beginning, saying, well, the thing about translating is that you have to go back to the source to find the original meaning. And I said, no, actually in this case I really didn't, because the book is not really about the nuance of language, it's really about the content of a book that is much more kind of, not so much a work of literature, but a work of, let's say, more like a technical theatre book. And so when I was thinking about what is translation, what are the various forms of translation, and I would say that I am a translator. I'm an artist, and therefore I think what artists try to do is to translate disorder into order in some way, anarchy into form, random observation into specific narrative. And so I realize now as I get older that my fascination since my childhood is really about the story and about why we tell stories, which is why, of course, why the world of translation is a vital system, because if we can't share each other's stories, then, you know, we're missing something terrible. I mainly am involved with cinema, and of course, I think what drew me to cinema in the first place was it is a universal language. So for example, when I was doing research into a performance art piece about really about New York, it was a piece called Animals of the City, and it was about how a place like New York is full of immigrants. It's full of many, many different nationalities. And so while I was there doing this research, I became fascinated by the immigration issue in America. And particularly now it's very important, of course. And I was thinking how there is no such thing really as an American. Well, there are Native Americans, and then everybody else is from somewhere else. And these people in New York more or less came through one place called Ellis Island, just a small island outside of New York. It's a fascinating place. At that point it was being renovated, so I couldn't visit, but subsequently I visited this place. But I read a lot about it, and one of the most amazing things about Ellis Island, up until about the late 1920s, there was a huge cinema on Ellis Island, and the people coming off the ships would be held in Ellis Island while they were examined medically to see if they carried any diseases and so on. So they would be there for maybe many days, many weeks even. And it's a huge population. In the evening they had a cinema. And up until 1929, 1930, the films were silent. So the language of cinema was entirely a visual language, and everybody understood the films. After 1929, the talkies came in, and we had sound with cinema for the first time. And immediately that meant everybody didn't understand. So it was no longer a universal language, it was an American language. They were primarily in English, obviously. And it always struck me as a very kind of, again, ironic thing that this wonderful thing, cinema, suddenly became the thing that separated people rather than brought them together. Whereas before, their first experience of cinema in America was this fabulous idea of a silent film with music. So this idea of interpretation, I think, and the idea of storytelling and narrative has always been with me. I tell one or two little short stories before I get into the book. I was telling Lauren earlier about something that happened. When I was 18, I fell in love, really for the first time, and very deeply in love with a very enigmatic woman who was a little bit older than me. And it coincided with the time when I went to London from Newcastle, so I was studying music there, and she was still in Newcastle, so we began writing to each other. And like I say, I don't know if I was in love or whether I was obsessed, but I was certainly very interested emotionally in this woman. And she started writing to me, and I remember getting the first letter with such anticipation, and there was a smell of perfume about this letter. It was a strong scent. And I opened the letter and discovered that her handwriting was so strange that I had no idea what she was saying. Just occasionally one word, or I recognized my own name, but I don't know what she said. So I would write back to her in also a kind of slightly abstracted way, because I couldn't comment on her letter because I didn't know what she was saying. So our relationship by letter must have been very, very strange. I think she understood. I wrote very clearly. And she would reply, obviously, to what I'd said with a response. Unfortunately, I never understood the response. And we had many letters coming and going like this. And she went to Greece on holiday, and I have postcards also. So it's something that all my life has troubled me, that I never understood what our relationship was. Because we really didn't have a physical relationship, we had a letter relationship. And so recently I was tidying up my studio and I found the letters. And I decided that I would go to the next stage with this obsession. So I scanned every letter. And then with my assistant, I said, I want to translate these letters finally. And so I have now translated the letters. And I've discovered what she said, and I discovered so much about her, almost that I wanted to write to her, but I don't know where she is now. But I discovered an entire world that I was not aware of psychologically in this person that I was so interested in. So I thought that was a kind of nice translation story because it's a translation, not really a translation, but it's a kind of a sort of almost an Egyptology story, that's we have a text and then we find out what it means. So the book, the 36 Dramatic Situations, it came about through a completely sort of random event. I was commissioned by a Hollywood studio to write a story. I went and I'm very good at convincing people that I have an idea. So the idea was very simple, and I went, and funnily enough, this idea is the story I now want to make in Korea, by the way. I'll come to that. So the thing is, if you don't live in America, and if you don't live in Los Angeles, it's almost impossible to be a filmmaker that makes American films. Because like everywhere, they have their own secret societies, which means that if you don't have breakfast in Los Angeles, it's almost impossible to make a film in Los Angeles. It all depends on who you know and this kind of personal relationships and so on. And I realized that I wanted to make this film, but I needed therefore to buy a ticket and go to Los Angeles. So I did that. And I met lots of different studios and I convinced Paramount Pictures that I had a really good idea. And they said, we love your idea. Can you now write a treatment, let's say a 10-page treatment of your idea for this film? I said, sure, no problem. And so I came back to London and I had a deadline. I'd also foolishly said to them, I will give you that idea by February the 21st. That's in 3 weeks' time. And they said, wow, that's really impressive. I said, no, it's easy for me, I can do that. So I got back and of course I did nothing, which is always what I do when I have a good idea. I do nothing till the last moment, very last moment. And I think of this as a kind of subconscious creative period where by not thinking about something, you allow your mind to dream in a way. And the idea, I always think the idea will come at the last moment. And so well, that's my excuse. There's another way of saying this, I'm very lazy and I should have just done some work, but I didn't. I kept putting it off, going, the idea is going to come. And then the other thing I do when I have a deadline is I do something else. So I maybe iron all my clothes, or in this case, I decided to tidy up my bookshelf. So I had a lot of books on the floor, and then no space. And then I made a decision that, every so often I would go through all my books and I would give away 50% of my books. Because I don't want books just because they're books. I only want the best books. And so sometimes you read a book, you go, it's quite good, I don't need to read it again. I will never open the book again. Rather than putting it on the shelf where it's impressive, I'll give it to someone. So I thought, that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to organize my shelf. I'm not going to do any work on the script. So I started work on the shelf, and of course I had a lot of books. So I suddenly realized I was surrounded on the floor by books, and there was complete chaos. There was anarchy with my books. And then one of the books I found was very slim and it was green, and I looked at it and I thought, I've never seen this book before. It was called The 36 Dramatic Situations. And I realized, I think a student gave it to me maybe a long time ago. So, surrounded by these books, I started looking through this book. Thought, that looks quite interesting. And then I read it, sitting on the floor with the books. And I thought it's a very, very interesting book. It's a very interesting idea. The idea that all stories will consist of combinations of 36 possibilities. That's all. He claimed that you don't need any more than these 36. There are other writers who claim you only need 5, or that there's only 3 stories, basically. But, you know, so there's, in the world of literature, there have always been theories about systems of writing stories. Anyway, I finished the book and I became really interested in this as an idea. I was also fascinated by how old-fashioned the book was, how the things it was talking about no longer existed in many instances. In our culture, they had gone. Also, the writers that the Pulte was talking about in the late 19th century, I started Googling them. I never heard of any of them. And in fact, even trying to find them on the internet, they didn't seem to exist anymore. They seem to have just vanished with time. A few of them survived, and of course he also talked about Shakespeare and about, you know, the Greeks and so on. So obviously they were references that still existed. And already an idea started to form in my head, and I started writing in my notebook because I thought the concept was interesting. I also thought the concept might be useful to the story that I was supposed to write. The idea that, you know, maybe that was subconsciously why I was waiting. Why I wasn't working was because I was waiting for something to happen. And it did. So I made some notes, and then I rang my publisher and I said, look, I've had an idea to take this idea of this 19th century theatre book and let's make a book about cinema, purely, which is theatre, but it's contemporary theatre, using the same kind of structure, but I want to completely rewrite it. So he said, sounds good, go ahead, you know. And he'd helped me publish the first book on digital filmmaking, and I explained to him I wanted to make it very accessible for young writers. And so that was the genesis of the idea. And so I should have then just put my notebook down and then finished the script that I was supposed to do, but I didn't, because I became actually much more interested in this. But an interesting thing happened. The deadline came, and I knew I had 24 hours left. And I had been looking at this and these possibilities, and literally at the last minute, I just sat down and I wrote the synopsis in 2 hours. And I swear it was because I had absorbed so much of these ideas. And these ideas opened me up into such a fresh and uncluttered idea of what a story could be. And one of the things I realized as a writer, because I write always my own films, is that we become autobiographical so quickly. We look for things in our own life that we think could be interesting, and we try and convert them into a story. The great filmmaker Luis Buñuel, a Spanish filmmaker, he is a very funny quotation which I use in the book. He said, if as a child you have the good fortune to have 3 horrible things happen to you, then you use that for the rest of your life. You know, each time slightly disguising the story, but that becomes the kind of DNA for your storytelling method afterwards. And I agree with him. But I'm also very bored by myself, by my own story. You know, it's like, I'm bored. I've used it before in films and it's okay there, but I don't want to keep using it. And when I was making a film some time ago called Mr. Jones, which was a portrait of a bipolar personality, a manic depressive, I read the textbook on bipolar disorder, and there's a chapter in the middle about manic depression and creativity. And it lists all the very famous artists and creative people who have been bipolar, and there are many, many of them. And then at the very end it said, however, one of the greatest storytellers in the world was not bipolar. His name was William Shakespeare, and he was just a good storyteller. He's not Hamlet, he was not King Lear. He was writing stories, he was inventing stories. And I thought, again, that's a refreshing approach. In the 20th century, we became so autobiographical. It became in our music, in our literature, in everything. As painters, you know, we ceased to be storytellers. We became self-obsessed, I would say. So that was also an interesting aspect that opened me up, and since then has made me re-examine the way we use narrative and how we tell stories, and where do these stories come from, and how universal are they? And, you know, does a story that you write for England or for Korea, does that resonate? Does that resonate? No? 1, 2. 1, 2. 1, 2. I've been censored. 1, 2. Thanks, Laura. So then the process of actually writing the book, I finally did my homework and I delivered the story to Paramount, and I'll just say a little thing about that. So I wrote then a story that takes place in Los Angeles. It was let's call it a thriller, slightly futuristic story. And then, as I say, I don't live in Los Angeles anymore, so me trying to have the film financed meant by email, occasionally visiting. It's very, very difficult. And then at a certain point, quite recently, I became much more fascinated by what's happening in Korea, in South Korea, with the film industry and also with television, and even K-drama, and I'm fascinated by what's happening in a very good way. I think it's very positive what is happening here. And so in the summer I decided to come. I just bought a ticket, and as Lauren said, I came and started meeting people and exploring possibilities. And one of the ideas I had was the idea of taking this story that I'd written for Los Angeles and having it translated into Korean, and actually making a film in Korean with Korean actors speaking Korean, which I don't speak Korean, so obviously that will be a challenge. On the other hand, I do know the story and I do understand how actors work, so that's a project for the future, which I hope happens. For me, that would be a very interesting way as a filmmaker of trying something different. So anyway, so then I started work on this. What I do when I create something, either it's a film or writing something, is I just assemble initially. It's very like making a film in the sense you shoot many, many scenes and you think that they're going to work because you, as a writer, you've created a sequence. One thing I've discovered over the years is this, that there is very little connection between the act of writing a film as a piece of literature, a script, and actually the film itself. Once you've made the film and you start literally editing the film, you realize the dynamic is radically different from the process of writing, let's say, a novel or writing a story. And this is for a very simple reason, that when we look at a film as an audience, our eye is the dominant sense that we're using. Even though sound is very, very important, we are seduced by the eye. When you're reading, even though of course you're using your eyes for the most part, a part of the brain that is actually dealing with the narrative is a very different part of the brain. I would say literature is a much more evolved art form than cinema. Cinema is the most popular art form that we have, and is our dominant storytelling genre now. So, in a way, I love cinema. I also hate cinema for the simplification of ideas that it's responsible for. Its lack of ironic potential sometimes, and almost intellectually, it's quite dumb sometimes, cinema and television. But on the other hand, when it works really well, when you see something really well made, it's also magnificent. But I worry about the standard of cinema now, and also the standard of writing or translating, let's say, script into cinema form. So, my point being that when I make a film, I shoot many, many scenes, and then I have them on my menu, and then I start putting them into a sequence, and then I look at them, and I wait for a moment where the things that I've assembled in a certain sequence, I would say, they speak to me at a certain point. And it's an interesting thing. The next stage is when you show that to an audience, the audience then speaks to you. You may love the film, I may be in love with the film, and then at a certain point I see the audience is bored. They're shifting, they're going to the bathroom, they're making phone calls, or cinema these days is like a zoo. I no longer go to public cinema because I get so upset by the audience, making so much noise and having their life in the cinema. So, but anyway, they do speak. If they're bored, they tell you very quickly by leaving often. So then you start to realize another truth about your story, and so on. And I feel that writing is somehow similar, although it's not quite so public, which is, first of all, you just deal with the mechanics of how you're going to make a modern version of this story. So I took the original, and of course, obviously there were 36 dramatic situations. So I did what I do when I'm writing. I got some postcards, and I got 36 postcards, and I wrote the name of each dramatic situation on the 36 postcards, and I put them on the wall. And then I started looking at each situation in the original, in the French, in the 1890s, and the things he was talking about. And fundamentally, the subject remains the same, which is family, loyalty, jealousy. I mean, you can see from the titles of these situations: recovery of a lost one, remorse, erroneous judgment, when you make the wrong judgment for whatever reason, jealousy, mistaken jealousy, rivalry. This is one I love. The discovery of the dishonor of a loved one, which is kind of fundamental to all literature in a way. And then I realized there are some, very basic truths. Nothing changes. We are concerned about dying. We are very concerned about other people dying that we love. Family remains vitally important. The idea of a God is the big question. Is it what happens after we're dead? And preparation for these dramatic moments. How do we prepare? And of course the answer is we prepare by storytelling. This was always, and through theatre, this was the function of drama, which was to kind of have a public forum where we could discuss these things through a fantasy, through a story, through a fiction. And again, this connected me again with these very basic emotions, which I feel in many ways I'd lost contact with, because you become more obsessed with the idea of proving that you're a great filmmaker, or proving that you're a great writer by dealing with philosophical, esoteric subjects and so on. Because we are also a secret society, and as filmmakers we want to impress other filmmakers. As writers we want to impress other writers. We care about the public, but we probably care more about our own peer group and the respect that we feel that we deserve from these people. Am I the best? Am I original? Am I doing good work? Am I a failure? And so on. And these things are very part of life, and I understand, but if it gets to the point when you no longer have contact with your audience, and the question, why are you doing this? Why are you telling a story? So as I was going through each category, I was asking that question. And I did a couple of radical things where the big question was, and I asked you this question, what is the difference between cinema and theatre? You could argue that cinema is just theatre that is recorded, rather than with live actors. But that wasn't good enough for me, so I was really struggling and searching for, I wanted one truth, which is why I think cinema is more interesting than theatre. And I started asking people, what do you think? What do you think is the essential difference between cinema and theatre? And then eventually I found a quotation from Ingmar Bergman, obviously one of the greatest filmmakers of all time. And he said the following, he said, cinema is the ongoing exploration of the human face. I thought, wow, that's amazing. And that is exactly how I feel. Because I think, as Lauren said, I'm also a photographer, I'm a portrait, and I'm obsessed with portraits. Actually, I love landscapes and all the rest of it, but my obsession would be the human face. And every face is different. And as a director of cinema, the essential difference is the close-up. The fact that when we have an interaction between a man and a woman, let us say, or anybody, the camera can get so close to the face that when someone is telling a lie, the eye can move the smallest amount, or the eyebrow can move, or the mouth can just make a small nuance, and the audience immediately knows that the person is not telling the truth. Whereas if you were doing that on the stage of a big theatre, in order to make that point, you'd have to use huge gestures, you know, and also the voice would have to be so loud. What do you mean? Where were you on Friday? I was at the doctor's, you know, because otherwise the people at the very back wouldn't be able to hear. And so when they say, oh, I think you're lying, you know, so you realize that theatre, in a way, is like a mime. It's like a pantomime. We accept it because these actors have become so good at doing this that it almost seems natural, but it's not. They're always throwing their arms around and shaking their head like this, and you know. And in cinema, when I'm working with actors, and if I work with a theatre actor, I say, bring it down, bring it down, bring it down, because they want to do these gestures, and you know. And I said, no, no, do nothing, just use your eyebrow, you know. I was once working with a very famous actress in a very important scene, a love scene, and very tragic. And the two lovers were having a confrontation, and it was a wide shot. And she was standing against the wall, and her foot was tapping like this because she wanted to know why this didn't work, right? And so I said to her, look, you must keep your foot still. And she said, no, but I'm expressing myself. Yeah, I said, yes, but on a big screen, your foot is going to be this big, and it's going up and down, and the audience will just look at your foot. They won't look at your face anymore. And it was almost impossible to get her to stop moving her foot, you know, because she wanted that to be her performance. So when I started thinking about all these things and what is the difference between theatre and cinema, it then became the key to how I wrote the book. So I try and stress, you know, what is possible in a film, and with a camera. So the camera is the most vital thing. Obviously, for the filmmaker, if you don't have a camera, you can't make a film. So, but I started assembling scene by scene, dramatic situation by dramatic situation, everything that came up as a possibility. And then you started to realize that this book was written in the 1890s. The sexual politics were almost farcical, you know. In the original book, it was all about the men, and the women were to be rescued, to be blamed for jealousy, to be kidnapped, you know. They were basically just props, and these are all stories about men. And so one of the things I suggest in the book is that whenever you are writing a story, if you think it's a man doing this and a woman doing this, stop and reverse the idea. So give the man's role to the woman and give the woman's role to the man. And it's quite remarkable if you take the most banal, cliched story and reverse the gender expectation, it becomes very, very interesting straight away, because you think, oh, mainly because you haven't seen it before, you know. So already that gives you a completely fresh menu of possibilities for your storytelling. And so The same with ideas about race. Interestingly, and in Korea, this would also be an interesting point. Here, family is very strong, still very, very strong. I know this from my K-drama. I know that the mother is a very, very strong figure. You don't argue with your mother, and I come from a place where you argue with your parents all the time, and in your terms, you are very disrespectful. So the idea of respect and honor and good behavior, good social behavior here is interestingly very, very strong. Certainly in America it's not, and certainly not in Britain. It may be innately still there, but in terms of the way families behave with each other, it's radically different. However, when the book was originally written in the 1890s, family was still, the most important thing. And then I realized that actually now the absence of the family, particularly if you look at American stories where it's always the story about families that are being separated, children that no longer know their parents, people moving from one town to another. So the idea of separation, the absence of family becomes a big, big point. So then I started kind of thinking about that a lot in the book. And all those social things that were taken for granted at the end of the 19th century, and I realize in theatre, and often in many of our writing, people still are writing in the same way, even though there is no specific connection with our times. So it became also quite a radical approach at going, why are we still telling that story in that way? Why can't we change? So then I started trying to find examples of films that had used these situations. So I analyzed over 200 films with the idea of looking at the storyline in the film and going, how many situations are they using? This became fascinating. So in a Bergman film, maybe he's only using 3 ideas or even 1 idea. In an adventure story like Indiana Jones or James Bond or something like that, and I make a list at the end, I can't remember exactly, but they're using 18 situations or more than 20. So basically they're just going from idea to idea because it's a kind of almost like a serial adventure story. So these are just, in other words, they become devices. They're not the central point of the story anymore. And then I analyzed my own films, and I realized that I was using the same situations over and over again, And then I analyzed Scorsese's films. He's using the same ideas over, and you can start to see almost like a DNA analysis of, the same would be true of novelists, and and you know that because you recognize the style of a writer. But like I say, if you analyze Shakespeare, no, he's using different combinations all the time because he's a great storyteller. So I carried on. I was obviously working on films at the same time, so I wasn't writing all the time. So finally, I had assembled, let's say, my first draft, and I had my 36 postcards. I was also in the middle of now a problem with a script. And at a certain point when I was tidying up my desk, I put all the postcards together, and I realized I had a pack of cards. So I went on the internet and I bought, hundreds of plain cards, nothing on them. And I created my own pack of cards, just with my handwriting. And then there was a moment when I thought, okay, I have a problem with my script, I don't know what to do next. And so, okay, I'm going to take a card. So I just randomly took a card, and it was altered states. It wasn't, this is the one I just took now. And it says obsession, fixation, loss of control, kind of madness it means, for whatever reason. I thought, wow, that's a great get out of jail card, because if you have a dream or your madness, then you're allowed to behave in a way that is not rational, and maybe that's now what I need to do in my script. So, like I say, I just took this card now, so it wasn't the one I actually took, but had I taken this, that's what I would have thought, And then I became sort of fixated by the idea of these cards, thinking, well, you know, this book is useful, but actually this is even more useful. The idea that we use something like a pack of cards, not to dictate exactly what the story is, but to help us start telling the story, to help us get out of the rut of the autobiographical. You know, because always before, when I started to write a script, I'd try and think of something interesting that had happened to me, and I'd use that as the basis for the story. Like I say, I kind of got bored with myself and my own story. So the idea of taking, you know, using these, so I invented a little trick, which is you take 3 cards, and then, you know, you look at them, and then you can change them in any sequence you like, just the 3 cards, and use that as the beginning of a story. And then I always say, you know, if it gets you started on a story, and you start on a journey, then you no longer need them, then forget the cards, you know. It's just a device. The other thing was I've always been interested in a book called the I Ching, or the I Ching, which I'm sure you know. And in that book, Carl Jung, writes at the introduction, and he talks about the importance of the randomness of the I Ching, and how a kind of obsession with, like I say, disorder and finding order within the disorder. But mainly the element of chance, using chance as yours. And I realized that some of the things that have happened to me in my life have been directly the result of chance, not my premeditated ambition or my desire, but something that happened, a meeting or being in the right place at the wrong time. And that these events have radically altered my life. So the idea of using this kind of chance also really appealed to me. And so I rang the publisher and I said, look, I'm very happy with the book, but I'd also like to do these cards as well. And initially they were very enthusiastic about this, but they're an old school British publisher. And Lauren's kind of going, well, of course, it's 2 hours. 2 hours?
Yes.
No,
Just
bring it down soon. Yeah. Okay, yeah. And then unfortunately they said we can't make the cards because we're publishers, we only do books. And so I had to ultimately make the cards myself and market them myself and put them on Amazon myself and try and so then I started giving them to other filmmakers and to writers and to musicians, and they seemed very, very happy with using the cards. And so there's a man called J.J. Abrams, who's just been voted the most powerful person in Hollywood. And a friend of mine works with him, and she said, oh, I'd love to give him the book and the cards. So I sent them, and he wrote a very charming letter to me saying, I'm actually writing a script now using your cards, and could I have another pack as well? So they are slowly starting to have some success. And as I say, it was a shame that the publisher couldn't see the kind of wisdom of doing both of them at the same time, but you know, whatever it takes. So that was the genesis of the book. Have I missed anything, Lauren, that's vital to the story? Okay. That's my translation. Okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for the insightful talk, and I'd like to invite our discussants now to come forward. They'll talk. Is there time still? Or? So, Mike, could you please? We'll all sit together. Yeah.
안녕하십니까. 오늘 토론자로 나선 오상현이라고 합니다. 저는 전공이 비교문학입니다. 윤혜준 교수님의 잘못된 제목들은 아주 짜임새 있게 잘 분류하고 지적을 해주셨는데 이것은 빙산의 일각이라고 하는 생각은 우리 모두 다 공감하고 있을 겁니다. 자, 제목 이론이 아마도 내용은 더 그럴 것이다라는 생각이 듭니다. 오역은 어디나 있습니다. 마치 인체를 들여다보지 못하는 의사가 오진을 하는 것처럼 오역은 앞으로도 계속 발생될 것이지만 그걸 앞으로 어떻게 해결할 것이냐는 인간과 AI가 많은 협력 체제가 이루어져야 될 것 같습니다. 윤동주의 시는 대단히 명시이고 쉬운 한국어로 쓰여져 있지만 입새를 입 사이로 보느냐 입 사귀로 보느냐에 따라서 오역도 되고 정역도 됩니다. 그런데 이 이부키 고라고 하는 아주 그 시를 잘 번역하는 일본인 한국어 번역자가 일본인의 한국어로부터 일본어의 번역자가 오역한 것을 일본 교과서에 실었습니다. 자, 과연 이것을 어떻게 해야 될 것이냐는 앞으로 많은 그 반성과 또 그 올바른 번역으로 유효되었으면 하는 생각입니다. 한자라는 텍스트 장치를 언어 권력으로 일삼아 세도를 부렸던 상층부의 일관된 권력 구조의 시기를 마감짓고 세종대왕은 한글 창제라는 언어 복지를 구현한 세계적인 인물이라고 하는 것은 인류 모두가 다 알고 있다고 생각을 합니다. 자, 그런데 그 한글과 한자가 잘 조합을 이루어서 한국의 근세의 언어로 정착할 거라고 생각을 했는데 임진왜란을 거쳤고 또 일제강점기에 한국어는 완전히 망가졌습니다. 근데 이걸 과연 어떻게 할 것이냐 라고 하는 입장에서 이번 윤혜준 교수님의 발표는 매우 의의가 있다고 생각을 합니다. 자, 그런데 과연 잘못된 오역은 일본이 물려준 잘못된 강요인지 아니면 당시 수용자, 즉 번역하는 조선 지식인의 실력의 부족함인지는 일일이 검토를 해봐야 됩니다. 자, 그러나 방금 말씀드렸던 것처럼 윤혜준 교수님의 학문적 반성을 내보인다고 하는 입장에서는 앞으로 우리가 다양한 방법을 통한 올바른 번역으로의 회복, 자, 이것이 매우 중요하다고 생각을 하는데, 자, 이러한 입장에서 저는 오늘 그 윤혜준 교수님께 질문을 드리는 것보다는 한 가지 제안을 드리고 싶습니다. 지금까지 일제시대 때부터 지금까지 번역된 제목만이라도 한 수천 권 될 텐데 그거를 다시 아카이브에서 리스트화 했으면 정말 좋겠습니다. 잘 부탁드리겠습니다. 제가 오늘 그 한 잔 가져왔습니다. 한 잔 가져왔는데 역시 이제 아까 말씀드린 것처럼 영어에도 엄청난 많은 번역에 잘못된 게 있는데 예를 들면 거기 첫째를 보면은 다이어가 이빨, 태양은 가득히 맞는 번역입니다. 그런데 원래 프랑스의 르 플랭 솔레이유라고 하는 것이 과연 태양은 가득히와 등가성이 있는가는 한번 생각을 해봐야 됩니다. 다음에 이제 3번에 가제토 토모니 사리누. 자, 이것도 바람 함께 사라지다 맞는 번역이지만 본 위스트 윈드가 등가적인지도 한번 생각을 해봐야 됩니다. 자, 그런데 4번을 보시면 모점은 Love is many splendid thing. 제가 일본어식의 번역이어서 죄송합니다. 자, 이것은 차라리 일본어의 모점을 그대로 갖다 썼던 게 더 좋았던 것 같고 007 위기일발은 그냥 생략하겠습니다. 다만 기타 직역에 의한 번역 용어는 예를 들어서 미필적 고의라든가 위법성 조각 차유라든가 또는 그 최근에 유행하게 된 소확행. 이 소확행은 한 30년 전에 무라카미 하루키가 어느 수필집에서 쓴 건데 지금에 와서 상당히 그 관심을 많이 갖고 있지만 한국인들은 소확행이 무라카미 하루키가 만든 신조라는 것을 모르고 있습니다. 자, 따라서 앞으로 우리는 일본으로부터 건너오는 일본 작품 또는 일본어로 번역된 타국의 작품들을 면밀히 볼 필요가 있겠다는 생각이 듭니다. 제가 발표 준비한 것은 여기까지입니다. 네, 자, 마치겠습니다.
Should I go next? I think I'll be the only one who will be discussing in English, so please excuse me. Well, I had an honor to read this book, preparing my discussion, and while I was reading this book, I thought about artificial intelligence of algorithm of creating, many different stories, because we are living in a post-human era when AI can do so much better in many different fields, and how we human beings can invent better stories, if not necessarily, entertainment, because AI can write really well-read logical plots. So having said that, I truly enjoyed this book, Mr. Figgis' idea of the 36 dramatic situations, but the original book, Georgi Polti's 19th century classical text, the 36 dramatic situation, was highly influenced by Commedia dell'arte, the writer Carlo Gozzi from the 18th century. And I like to highlight this point because the nature of the profound idea of having, all the stories can be invented based upon a certain number of dramatic situations might lend itself to a danger of, highlighting plots way too much than the other element in drama. So I like to highlight the other element of drama, in this case, character. So Gozzi, Carlo Gozzi, the Italian Commedia dell'arte writer, when he was thinking about the basic plot lines, he actually had a very fierce dispute with Goldoni, another Commedia dell'arte writer. And Goldoni was middle class playwright, and he wanted to make Italian theater really innovative, a real life representation of ordinary people in Italy. Whereas Gozzi really thought that Commedia dell'arte had to be much more fantastic. So he focused a lot about fairy tale, and he wanted to make it much more spectacular, larger than life. So he ended up creating these basic plot lines. And as we know today, both Goldoni and Gozzi, they were all forgotten in a way. And Goldoni, after having that fierce dispute, Goldoni ended up leaving to France, and he influenced French Commedia Française. But interestingly, this Commedia dell'arte, Commedia Française, both of the theaters' aesthetics were highly, formulaic. And retrospectively, we now classify them as neoclassicist theater. And this neoclassical rule of rigid plot structure and stock characters didn't survive that long. So we now not many people remember, any famous characters from Commedia dell'arte or any French theater. Whereas in Great Britain, they usually use bare stage, and all those bare stage actually created much more space for the audience, giving willing suspension of disbelief. So that theatricality was very much revived, and we now have this Shakespeare and all the other great playwrights. So I must say that this notion of highlighting dramatic situation itself might lend itself to a danger of more formulaic storytelling. So my question is actually this: how can you find as a scenario writer, how can you find the right balance in the process of storytelling between dramatic situations and characterization, because all the great theater ended up being great theater of characters,
Mhm.
right? We remember Hamlet and Macbeth and all those King Lear. So that's my first question. My second question would be, as a filmmaker, when you actually do digital filmmaking, in the process of filming, how much level of creativity or liberty to your own camera, so the camera can capture the film subject, and so that you can probably give more freedom of choice to the film subject. In this case, you're actor, actress. Because I was able to see some of the clips from YouTube, your digital film productions, and I can clearly see that you highlight the physical presence of your subject. And the camera seems to be really nicely capturing that, I guess, presence much better than the other major, mainstream commercial films. So, and we always, whenever we think about digital film production, we think a lot about much more experimental, aesthetics. So, and while we associate this kind of dramatic situation with commercial mainstream films, so how can you find the right balance between giving more freedom to the film subject and your own camera, than just rigidly creating certain dramatic situations? So two keywords, characterization and camera. That would be my
Well,
questions.
in cinema, we have a ridiculous situation where cinema is the youngest of all our art forms. So let's say the talkies came at the end of the 1920s, and we're only 100 years, not even 100 years later, and already cinema has created such rigid rules because it's commercial. If you think of all the art forms, it's the one that is the most expensive. Therefore, it's the most capitalistic of all the art forms in that sense. There is an expectation